Welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex and this video is sponsored by Squarespace. In this video I'm going to attempt to paint a miniature using only oil paint. Not just an oil wash or something like that, actually painting with oil paints. Can I do it? And what's the point? Also, I've got a bit of a book recommendation for you. And so, another epic tale from the hobby realm. In this video, I want to share what I personally consider the most rewarding way to paint with oil paints. The workflow is different from when painting miniatures with acrylics, and so if you want to try oil paints out, I hope this video can help you get started. Let's just quickly talk about oil paints for those unfamiliar. Oil paints are, simply put, colored pigments bound together in liquidy form by the use of linseed oil, as opposed to the most common form of hobby paint, acrylic paint, which is colored pigments bound together in a liquidy form by use of water-soluble acrylic plastic stuff. The major difference between the two is that oil paints take a lot longer to dry as opposed to acrylic paints that dry in an instant. Why you would paint with oil paint instead of acrylic paint is not a matter of what is best. We get awfully hung up on, quote, what is best, unquote. Oils are just different, a different thing that offers alternative ways to paint. Acrylics are the norm, but once that label could have been stuck on oils and enamels. We could make the analogy that oil paint is the vinyl record and acrylics is Spotify. But let's start with a look at the miniature, as this is an important addition. This is a metal miniature from Bow and Blade Games and is no other than the King Urien of Reged. Sounds like fantasy. Well, it's actually history. A 6th century warrior king from the northern parts of England. This was a gift from my patron Mike. I visited the Lake District in the UK and we had a Patreon meetup. Well, it was just me and Mike in a pub. As a mini symbol of this great part of the world, I was gifted King Urien. Check out Bow and Blade if you live around there. Supporting local game stores is important. As miniatures that are given as gifts are the most important miniatures in any collection, I just had to paint this. And to complete the image and the symbolism, I based him and his mighty steed on a piece of stone from one of the great northern fells I climbed together with my son and my dad. Before I prime metal minis, I always give them a clean with alcohol. When scraping mold lines, quite a fair amount of them on this mini, and basing and so on, grease from your fingers will tend to stick to the mini. Cleaning helps the primer stick better. I prime the miniature in black using my favorite Ammo by MiG one-shot primer. Well, that is after I clean out a massive clog in my airbrush. Now let's talk about technique and workflow. Obviously, we need oil paints. Most often the best place to buy oil paints are in art supply stores. There's many brands and level of quality, but if you're just starting out, getting a base set of regular Winsor & Newton oil paints is probably what will be the most available. I squeeze out my oil paint on a piece of cardboard, smudge them out a little and let them sit there for 10 minutes or so. The cardboard soaks up some of the excess oil and this procedure can shorten drying times a little. I mix the paints with white spirit or odorless white spirit to a similar consistency as I'm used to from acrylic hobby paints. I don't really have a ratio to share, just mix a little white spirit into the oil paint until you find what you like to work with. If you plan on doing this a lot, you can do pre-mixes and keep them in dropper bottles for future use. White spirit fumes are not good for your brain. This goes for the odorless ones as well. Read up on the necessary precautions. We're not using a massive amount here, but painting in a well-ventilated space, like next to an open window, is highly recommended. I've tried 3 different types of non-toxic plant-based thinners by now, but unfortunately none of them have worked out well for miniature painting. The technique I'm about to use requires at least 2 brushes. One for the application of wet paint, the other a dry one for blending. In the middle here I have my application brushes of various sizes, mainly synthetic, as the white spirit is rather harsh on natural hair brushes. But I've also got 2 old discarded natural hair brushes. On the right I've got some blending brushes. These are more discarded natural hair brushes, but again synthetic is more wise, as these will get rather battered. These brushes will never get dipped in wet paint, only used for blending on the miniature. On the left, I have some deluxe crap bottom of the drawer, why did I even keep these around brushes, for mixing paint on the palette and so forth. Once your brushes get used with oil paints, even if they're cleaned after the session, I'd keep them separate for only oils and not try to use them for acrylic paint. And now for the special technique, said the necromancer to the corpse. In the grand scheme of things, the thing that makes oil paints different from acrylics is that they don't dry fast. That is the basis on why I use them, utilizing the benefits of paint that can be mixed and blended on the miniature. Trying to use the standard workflow of acrylics, layering, washes, glazing and so forth, is not going to work here. Instead, I use a technique that brings out the best of the medium at hand. Simple example, we paint on one paint, like the yellow here, with the application brush. Then, when swapping paints, wipe off excess paint on a tissue. Avoid cleaning your brush between paints with white spirits, like we do with water when dealing with acrylics, unless the white spirit is absolutely necessary. We then add the next paint, not blending the two together, we just paint it next to the one we want to blend with. I've used a red and a yellow here for extreme visual purposes. We then take the dry blending brush and mix the two paints together where they meet. Whenever there's too much paint on the brush, I wipe it off on a tissue. These blending brushes never touch white spirit for the entire session. White spirit will transform them into erasers. Here is a hasty example of doing the same thing on my test mini. I've applied the red to the recesses and shaded areas on the helmet, the yellow on the rest. Then I blend these together, creating smooth gradients of orange between the red and yellow. So this is not about getting a smooth one-coat surface that you can put a wash on or dry brush. It's about working with the paints on the miniature while they're wet, creating smooth blends with very little effort, something that is very difficult to do with acrylics. We're not replacing one medium for the other. Oil paints can do vastly different things that acrylics are not made to do, and this goes both ways. Many things are far easier with acrylics that are an absolute pain to do with oils. As oil paints do take a long time to dry, layering on covering layers is a little out of the question. You know, with acrylics you add a thin layer to not obscure detail, to then pretty much immediately layer on yet another for proper coverage. 2 thin coats or something. I mean, this can sort of be done with oil paints, but to wait for a day between layers is maybe a bit too zen even for me. So I strongly recommend swiftly blocking out colors using acrylics first. As you saw on the test, not quite Space Marine helmet, a Zenithal Prime works fine, but having some kind of color going underneath is even better. P.S. Don't bother trying to paint oils on just a black Prime Mini. I'll never hear from you again. And so my favorite approach is the Zenithal Prime, followed by a swift dry brush of white to catch the details. And then a very basic sloppy layer of contrast style paint. On the horse, I sprayed it on with my airbrush, just tinting the surface, and on the king himself, I brushed them on. This could be done in any manner you prefer, and obviously, if I was painting something in just the one color, like a blue Space Marine, I'd probably just prime it blue and start from there. By now you might be saying, this is an awful amount of work to just get started. And you're kind of right. I mean, if this was one of 100 soldiers going into an army that needs to be on the table in a month or two, I would probably just stop here and go and have a stress release scream in the woods. But this video isn't about efficiency or painting an army in a weekend. It's not even got a new release from Games Workshop in it, not a clan rat in sight. But Zenithal priming and painting on the speed paints took me about 15 minutes. In the grand scheme of things, that is not a big deal. The minis are now ready to be painted with oil paint. Many worry about the effect of solvents and such on acrylics. The thing with white spirit is that it generally does not affect acrylic paint at all. I tested it on my test mini. By the way, having a test mini when embarking on new ventures like this is great. Great for any new project, oil or no oil. For testing schemes or ideas before you move on to the important mini at hand. But yeah, as you can see, regardless of some rather heavy scrubbing with white spirit on a Q-tip, nothing came off. My scheme is utterly sort of Celt on a grassy fell inspired. A lot of green, I'm thinking, like a bit of a thematic thing. The rest, rather muted, kind of like the weather up there, and so I picked out a few paints that when mixed and blended would automatically kind of take me to that muted place. A dark Prussian blue, a sort of muted magenta called Purple Madder, favourite paint that. A yellow, a black and a white, and a burnt umber brown as base for the horse. But before we start painting, I'd like to quickly talk a little about buying artist paints like oil paints compared to buying hobby miniature acrylics. If you go into an art supply store to buy oil paints, you'll find that there's quite a lot of different colours, but not nearly as many shades as some of our hobby brand acrylic paint producers supply. So you'll have to get into the habit, probably, of mixing some of your own paints. That said, there are some hobby brands, Scale Color and Ammo by MIG oil brushes, that make some oil paints that might be helpful out of a mini painting perspective, like skin tones and stuff like that. One thing to be aware...
Down here.
Hi.
Have you ever heard about Squarespace?
Yeah, sure, the sponsor of this video, but I was just...
Exactly. Let me tell you some more.
Okay.
Squarespace is an all-in-one platform for creating websites, an intuitive platform that I've been using for some time. Lucky for me, there's no need for expertise. You can choose between carefully curated layouts or start a completely personalized website with the new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint. A tailored website to suit your needs up in no time, optimized for all devices and with optimized SOE tools so you show up more often to more people. For me, Squarespace has been a great tool, starting with a nice template that I can adjust for my specific needs. I've created a website with introductions to my work, with galleries of my miniatures and such. It also hosts my online store. Customizing the shop with print-on-demand t-shirts as well as my own artworks and downloads has worked out well, and with a back end that makes my side of things simple when dealing with deliveries and fulfillment. The checkout and payment options for customers works seamlessly, accepting credit cards, PayPal and Apple Pay, but also pay later options like Afterpay and ClearPay. If you're looking for somewhere to display your art, sell merch, if you have a painting service or sell STLs, start up a website for your own game store or club, check out Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/52miniatures to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the oil paints. If you buy oil paints, artist oil paints, you'll find that most of the time they're single pigment paints. So a lot of mini paint brand paints are already mixed. It's mixed pigments, usually just to give us more shades, but also to cover better. What happens with single pigment paints is that some pigments don't really cover that well. They're a bit more transparent and some pigments are more opaque. And so you're getting into this little jungle when you're buying artist grade paints of how well the different pigments actually cover. So the whole thing is a bit of a journey when buying oil paints, because you're getting into that art world where people actually know things about their paints, whereas we hobby enthusiasts just kind of buy stuff and paint on. But anyway, pay attention to, usually you can read, there's a little symbol on all these tubes that'll tell you how well the paint covers. So this white, for example, has a little symbol on it that says that it's rather opaque, whereas this purple madder has a symbol on it that says it's rather transparent. This can be why some paints just take over and cover more when you're mixing around. Another thing to pay attention to when you're buying the paints is that when you buy artist grade paints or artist paints, you usually pay for the pigment inside. So the different tubes will vary in price depending on how expensive the pigment is. Whereas when you buy hobby paints, it's all just the same price per bottle. So just check what price category it is as well. Maybe you don't really need that really expensive pigment. So just a few things to think about when buying oil paint. Now let's paint some Celtic goodness, shall we? As you can see, I have a glass palette going. This is very handy. A leftover wall or floor tile works well too. I have my base paints mixed with white spirit separate and add to the palette for mixing, keeping a cover on the base paints to keep the white spirit from evaporating. I apply paint with an application brush rather ruthlessly, again not mixing on the model, just applying paint. Trying to work my way from light to dark, sort of corresponding the shades of paint with the zenithal prime. As I'm not cleaning my brush in between paints, moving from light to dark means I don't contaminate the bright paints on my palette with dark paint from the brush. And the other way around is no big deal, as the darker paints are usually more overpowering. Once I have a section covered in different paints, I swap to the dry blend brush and blend the different areas of paint together. This creates lovely gradients between the different paints. If my blending brush gets too contaminated with the paint, I rub it off on a tissue, cleaning it off as I go. Remember, no white spirit in the blending brush. Figuring out what direction to blend the paint is a bit of a journey of discovery, pushing bright paint into dark one or dark paint into a bright one, as well as learning to not rub around too much, ending up with just the one midtone. Something that is rather important for me is to make sure to get some rather dark lines in the recesses where one area of the model is connected to the other, so-called blacklining. Because oil paints give a rather blurry look, separation is more important to improve the contrast and distinction between parts. If we compare this pretty much unpainted side of the horse to the painted side of the horse, you get an idea of what we can create here. The oil-painted side is as smooth as the airbrushed side, but with all these lovely gradients between not only dark and light, but also between different colors, all done swiftly and very stress-free. After that first layer of horse skin is complete, I want to go back and add a little more excitement, but I'm going to do the saddle and all that first to get a better picture of how the horse is coming together. The horse should have a name, by the way. What would a Celtic warhorse be called? Suggestions in the comments, please. And please don't forget to like and subscribe while you're down there. On another note, I've been having issues with green lately, darn miserable color. But thanks to a patron, I've started highlighting it by adding white. Something I really like. Very desaturating, but a look I can get behind. Anyway, I'm now going to go back and add highlights. The horse's rump, the place I started to paint, is by now pretty much dry to the touch, so I can apply some refinement without worrying too much about them blurring into what's already been created. Now, not only do I want to add highlights, but maybe also a bit more of texture and excitement. I keep moving back and forth around the model, gradually building up highlights as I go. I mean, this is sort of what it's all about. The oil, as a medium for me, really lends itself to experimenting and having fun with colors and blends. Acrylics very much speed up the process, and that sometimes means my creative mind can't keep up. Instead, here I can sit calmly, listen to some music, and just let the paint do fun things. Try Bob Dylan's Lovesick, and you'll get an idea of my painting mood. I guess Urian was lonely up there on the fell. Highlighting is not at all the same thing as when working with acrylics. This is utterly forgiving and smooth, but also tricky to get sharp and distinct. But with the added benefit of essentially being able to erase every single mistake by just smudging it out. The look is very specific, not very crisp. It's difficult to get the really high, distinct highlights. But it looks like oil paint, and I like it. As the fells of the north of England are pretty much just green, well, that's what I'm going for as a theme. As mentioned, green is a tricky color for me. Why then paint a green base with a green mini on it? Well, how in the world will green not be challenging if I don't keep painting with it? This is kind of what goes for me in mini painting in general, I guess. It's easy to stay away from challenges and stick to certainties. I mean, not everyone in this hobby is in it for the challenge, I get that. But we do get stuck in routines sometimes, not finding the inspiration to paint. And for me, a great way to get out of it is a little challenge, or at least something new. Painting miniatures with oil paint doesn't have to be something one does all the time, but when stuck in what you do, maybe change how you do it to get a different perspective, and that might just bring all the other things back into focus. I promised a book recommendation, one that goes very hand in hand with this mini and that I believe I've been getting quite a bit of distilled inspiration from when it comes to this color scheme. Katharine Kerr and her Deverry book series starting with Daggerspell. This is Celtic-influenced high fantasy telling the story of Nevin. We could call him a mage, but a very humble one, a herbsman with superpowers. The setting is kind of refreshingly humble too. Rather than unimaginably large armies fighting the hordes of evil, we travel through a land where warbands contain a handful of fighting men. Castles are mere duns with small keeps. The magic is beautifully described and for some reason always reminds me of butterflies. But think in terms of scrying and visions. There's fairy folk that aren't fair, as well as elves and dwarves, but again not at all in a Rivendell or Moria fashion. And all very Celtic, kind of like visiting the world of my miniature with a bit of fantasy thrown in. Even dialogue in the book is written in a rather old-fashioned and stylized way. All in all, lovely world-building. The main story is based in a way on reincarnation and Nevin's several lives-long mission to set right mistakes of the past, but having to deal with the fact that the souls he's trying to, in a way, save keep dying to then get reborn. The narrative therefore jumps between times past and what is now, telling the story of the same people reborn and their fate, but with the main character as a constant companion. I'll be honest and say that I started reading the first book years ago and had a hard time getting into it, to then pick it up again, now enjoying it. And as fantasy tends to be, things get better along the way, and so by book number 3, things are great. Not because of better writing, just because it's a long story to tell. My only hang-ups is the sometimes very classic fairy tale vibe. We're dealing with a lot of princes and princesses, and after a while I miss the common folk. Things are also ultra-traditional. That the most evil folk described also tends to be gay is maybe not something that would have been passed through an editor today. The great highlights are the intimate descriptions of people and places and the great descriptions of magic, gods and fairies. The latter is very original and dreamlike. A good read or listen, something to keep you company while painting, or as for me, reading for inspiration and good stories. Now, back to the mini. I have to say I enjoyed painting the horse more than the rider. The large flat areas on the horse really lends itself to oil work. I mean, I still enjoyed all of it thoroughly, but doing small fiddly bits take a bit of getting used to. It can be done though. In one regard, because oil paint doesn't dry on the brush, it actually lends itself to some pretty fine brushwork. But it doesn't have the same crisp, sharp-edged result as acrylics. Edge highlights, for example, are, in my opinion, a lot easier to do with acrylics. And I think that is a good ending note. There's 2 ways of looking at working with oils. As a tool for efficiency, I'd probably consider painting parts of models with oils, like flowing capes, horses' rumps, tyranids, stuff like that, where the blending aspect really shines and is simple to do compared to acrylics. But then one could varnish and continue painting with acrylics like usual. Jumping between oils and acrylics is fine as long as you varnish in between. The other way of looking at it is as a painting experience not focused on efficiency or official Games Workshop look paint style. And for that, I'd thoroughly recommend trying painting with only oils. I really like the look as well, and would gladly paint an entire warband or something in this style. More to come, I hope. A thing worth mentioning is terrain as well. The stone base pretty much just painted itself, and that could be translated onto similar style of gaming terrain. Maybe I should paint my 6x4 gaming table with oils. Who knows? Depending on the thickness of oil paint, you can expect 1 to 2 days before paint is dry. Oil paint cures a little differently from acrylics, but it prefers warmth, a bit of a breeze, and sunlight to set. Kind of like people. So I tend to put mine in a window during summer or above a radiator during winter to speed up curing. Also, I find the paints a little shiny at times and varnish with a matte varnish when everything is set. I hope you like the look of Urien Reged on Not Yet Named Horse. I so enjoyed the tempo of working with oils as well as the visual results. I hope one day you'll give it a try. Thank you for watching. Please check out the Patreon. I need more patrons to meet in random pubs. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.